This is Flo, my homemade stop-motion doll, and this is the kind of thing I've been up to for the past couple of years. I went to University of Staffordshire to study game design and left with a degree in games animation instead. I have a little bit of a history with game design, but most of it was self-taught until now. I didn't really like making diagrams, truth be told, and my course specialised quite a lot on AAA design instead of indie, which is really what I'm all about. I took an intro semester of animation on a whim, and it absolutely lit my brain on fire, so I made the switch there and then. I learned a lot of 3D art basics here, nothing fancy, but I knew what the pipeline should look like. It meant I was in a strange position, where I've learned basic code through a college computer science course, and I had a good few design analysis projects behind me. So for my final year project, I wanted to try something big. How cool would it be to turn Flo's model, the real-life physical doll, into a 3D platformer character, like the kind of things that inspired a design, but animate it like it's still stop motion. I could use the Uni's photoscan in Studio 2, so I wouldn't have to model anything. There's a world where I could have animated it using traditional stop motion techniques and taken pictures of each frame individually, but as my first doll, Flo isn't very well built, and the materials I use definitely aren't long lasting. If I was able to create a 3D replica, I can still get use out of this thing, and it should be, hopefully, a pretty painless conversion into Unreal Engine. This was the pitch I presented for my final year project at uni. They said it sounded a bit overambitious, but they'd let me go ahead with it. So from this point onwards, I had just over 16 weeks to make this game from scratch, and 2 other modules to complete at the same time. You can use this video as a guide of how to make a game in this style, but this thing was more of a learning process for me. I'm not a 3D artist or a programmer, so there are many better ways to do all of this, and so many real tutorials to follow. A lot of the pipeline and software were things I was only able to do because I was in university full-time. Many other softwares are available, and I'll try to point them out where I can, either verbally or with on-screen indicators. I had the project blocked out into 5 main phases. I need to get Flo's 3D model looking nice, then rig and animate that model, and then program a basic movement set, give her a world to move about in, and playtest. Even if all these parts took about 3 weeks each, this meant I had more than enough time to finish everything before my 16-week deadline. We started in the photoscanning lab. This was the sticking point for the whole thing. If I couldn't get the doll to scan nicely, then my whole time frame would be off, or at worst, I'd have to scrap the whole idea. I only got pictures of this part of the process. I was way too nervous to be casual about recording footage in a place like this. The room cost more than a house, so I was afraid to touch anything. The way it works is that this thing that looks like an egg beater strobes a light on and off, which takes hundreds of pictures per second. If you take all those pictures from as many different angles as possible, you can stitch together a pretty accurate recreation of how an object exists in 3D space. There's also a version that uses lasers instead of photos, but that one doesn't give you any textures, so I thought photos were the way to go. We stood Flo on a little metal table, and because she has magnets in her shoes, I thought we could get a pretty nice T-pose. The doll struggled to balance, way more than I thought it would, which I guess proved the point that it wasn't really workable for stop motion, if she can't even stand upright. She ended up falling over a couple of times, and actually broke one of her legs after taking a really bad fall. I glued it back on, but we had to cut the recording session a lot sooner than I was hoping for. We took the base scan into an online program called Mixamo, where you can apply generic mocap data for models, and it did a lot better than I thought it would. The rig seemed to have all the parts separated properly, and it wasn't until I took it into Maya that I realised just how broken this model was. So obviously the model here isn't clean enough to animate with. The longer I thought about it, the more I realised that I wasn't going to escape having to learn sculpting and retopology and texturing, but hopefully I could still salvage something from all of this. The new goal was to make Flo a new model, using this one, that still looks like the original doll, but has a nice enough mesh to be easy to animate with. I took the model into ZBrush, which I could use a school's license for, but I downloaded for free on my iPad. I started by straightening the model into a T-pose, which revealed that big parts of my geometry weren't going to deform very well. Because the scan only takes pictures at a surface level, it meant details under the neck, trousers and wrist get totally lost, as the mesh gets blended into one object. I got around this by splitting up the model into separated parts for the head, ears, hands, torso, tail and shoes. This meant that I was able to move the parts independently from one another, like having the ears flap above the head without deforming the cheeks' geometry, or giving the feet their proper range of motion. I still didn't feel like my model looked nice, and my inexperience was really showing when it came to modelling difficult parts like shoes. So I asked my friend who works in comics if she'd be willing to give me a hand, which honestly saved my life here. We talked about it and decided the hands and feet should be bigger to help give that feeling of a 3D platformer mascot, and she helped give me draw-overs of parts of the model I struggle with. We also added a bit more realism to some things, like how the jumper bunches up and cuts around the tail, and my favourite detail was how the eyes work. Real stop-motion dolls usually have socketed eyes, or faceplates that the animators can swap out on a whim, but because I didn't have the time, or frankly the skill to make that happen, her eyes are actually little pieces of cardstock stuck on with blue tack. This also means that they're fully posable. You can use them to get expressions, or swap them out for other kinds of eyes for better emotion. I'd initially set aside a good 3 weeks for this modelling process, but it ended up taking more like 7, which was very surprising. That was almost half the time I had. Admittedly, I did have another animation module running at the same time, and with 3D modelling being so far outside of my skill set, my motivation for this wasn't amazing, but it still was much harder than I was ready for. Once I had this new model separated into all the different parts, I had to take it back into Maya, and then into... So ZBrush is technically free on iPad, but if you want to export it out of ZBrush, as in use it in another software, you need to pay for a monthly subscription. Great job, Maxon Computer GmbH. Regardless, I need to take the model into 3D Coat for retopology. Now, retopology is an entire art form and one with its own job role, usually, and I went into this with no experience as a 3D modeler. For anyone unfamiliar with the term, retopology is the process of taking your super detailed 3D model and making it more optimized, so you can use it without your computer setting on fire. It's why people make fun of 3D models that look like this in some games, because you can achieve something that looks exactly the same and runs exponentially faster by baking the detailed model onto the textures of a simpler model. Using something like Substance Painter, you import both models and tell the software how to map one model onto another. It then gives you what is called a normal texture, which says how light should reflect off different parts of the model. You place this texture onto the low poly model, and if done properly, it should look identical to the original. I spoke to my supervisor about what I should aim for in terms of a low poly game ready model, and I got a very generous 60,000 polys. For context, the Mario 64 Mario is 838 polys, and the Mario Odyssey Mario is just over 14,000 polys. This is still less than the several million that the sculpted file has, but it is still a lot for a player character. Because Flo would be the only custom model in the game, and I had really only planned on showing this game to a couple of people, it wasn't too big of a concern for now. This gave me a lot of room to be generous with how I made up parts of the model, and it also gave me a lot of space to design the topology around animation. Of course, to get a texture onto the model at all, my low poly needed to be unwrapped. I did a really simple UV job of the model, which, thanks to my new topology, didn't take that long. Only Flo's face was a bit tricky, and you can kind of see the seams if you look close enough. I baked my topology down to the low poly model, and I threw together a quick material with some smart material nodes, and I had a model. Ideally, for something like this, you'd want to really tailor the texture and the model for something it's being used for, with hand-picked textures or adapting from high-resolution photos, but I wasn't prepared to learn another new skill from scratch, so this would have to do. Well, actually, not quite yet. We still need to make a rig. I took Flo back into Maya and booted up a rigging plugin I quite like called Rapid Rig. All you need to do is line up the proxies with where they should be, giving special attention to parts like the fingers and the clavicles. You can add extra bits for things like the ears and the tail, and once you click Create Rig, it puts all the bones in place for you. The thing I like about Rapid Rig is that it handles all the difficult parts like IK and FK switching for you, and you can also make custom shapes and colours for your rig. It doesn't come with any skinning tools, so it takes quite a while to get a usable rig out of it, but a few hours of weight painting later, and we had a model that was pretty usable. Everything from the retopology step to this point was done in about 3 or 4 days. I was really in a rush at this point, as I was going home for winter break, and my supervisor said he wanted to see a playable demo by the time I came back. This didn't have to be anything fancy, but I needed to have a movement system, playable in a game, working in the animation style that would fit with what I initially proposed for this project. I wanted Flo to animate like she was made using stop motion, which has a few nuances to it. It's very trendy at the minute to create animations that look choppy, which, as has been very well documented, took off with the Spider-Verse films, and I like that style. I'm absolutely not hating on it. I was even the animator in a really fun group project this year that used choppy animation, and I think it ended up looking really good, but it's not what I wanted for Flo. Both styles use what are called stepped tangents, meaning the animation doesn't move in smooth curves, but instead goes up and down in steps. The difference being Spider-Verse regularly switches frame rates, and generally has a much higher frame rate than stop motion, especially classic or indie stop motion. Because of this, I limited myself to working on the rule that I would have a new pose every 3 or 4 frames, and for quick motions, maybe move that down to a pose every 2 frames. I made a quick walk and run cycle, a pretty bad jump, and a very bad idle, but for testing reasons, that was alright. I exported all my animations into Unreal Engine and made a small and simple animation blueprint, which made it so that her movement animation would change depending on how fast she was going. There were still 1,000 problems and the camera was absolutely horrendous, but as a proof of concept, I could show this to my supervisor and be happy that, at least in theory, this could work. I had built a very bad version of everything, but the important part was that I had built a version of it. By making the game terrible, yet functional, it meant that I could incrementally build up in tiny pieces, and it got me to the playtesting stage almost immediately, which is where generally I find my best ideas and strongest source of motivation come from. It means you can go in and analyse the key thing that your game or your artwork or whatever you're making is missing, and it's why I don't like to overly plan my projects before I start them. It doesn't have to be locked to just yourself either. Sending a project to a fresh pair of eyes will put everything you've made into a new context and give you ideas of what it is you're missing. Getting comfortable sharing unfinished work has helped me out so much with this project. It's much easier to course correct and build new fundamental systems while the game is still in this larval form. And in this case, after I clean my animations up, I wanted the ability to grab ledges. It's at this point that I should say, for those who haven't touched Unreal Engine before, it actually gives you quite a boost for making a playable character. It gives you a pretty solid template with a load of parameters you can tweak and play around with. You can change your character's speed, jump height, ground friction, a lot of things. Importantly though, and I don't really know why they do this, but the default Unreal character doesn't contain any code for grabbing ledges, meaning that you usually have to make this system from scratch. I adapted it from a tutorial online, but the key components still function about the same. Whenever Flo is airborne, a line trace is drawn about 8 cm away from the direction she's facing. If this collides with a surface, then another line trace is drawn perpendicular to that. The point where these 2 lines intersect is the point of the ledge. You can also do it the other way around, where the ledge itself is the trigger, which is much easier to set up, but it means that you need to place this ledge grab volume onto all of your ledges, so level design gets a little bit trickier. With the method I used, it means you can place any static mesh in your level and be able to climb onto it, and pull yourself onto the ledge with... Actually, you need to make sure to enable root motion in your animations. This means that the offset of your animation can translate into the location of the player character, and that still isn't working. Turns out the solution here was to change the player character's mode into flying, because only then does Unreal let you have vertical root motion. Figuring that out took me the best part of a week. I really like Unreal most of the time, but adding some base case functionality for a ledge grab would be great. Something I love about being at a university that focuses on games is knowing that all the other people there are genuinely interested in making something great. I was having a conversation with a friend about whether or not to include double jump, and after she convinced me that I should, she asked me what the point of my game was, and I didn't have a good answer. I said that it was a tech demo and it wasn't really meant to have a point, but that sounded stupid saying it out loud. I talked about adding a Mario Odyssey style of pickup, where maybe there's a certain amount of them throughout the level, and you play an animation when you find something, but it still felt like there was a big gap to jump between gameplay and real-world logic of why that matters. She completely made me 180 on this decision by saying, you should just pick up buttons, and I spent the rest of that day adding that functionality into the game. I should also talk a little bit about the particle systems I made for the game. I'm definitely not a VFX artist, but I know how to make particles happen when a character does something. I made smoke clouds appear at Flo's feet when she runs, and this double jump effect that I stole straight out of Smash Bros. The glow part of the buttons was fun to make too, and they even move with step motion just like the rest of the game. I also gave Flo a little idle break, where the spirit of the doll flies out the body, spins around a bit, and goes back into the body. This is probably something I'd like to go back and change looking back. A lot of people got confused and thought she got dizzy or bored, which wasn't really what I intended. There were some other ideas for what an idle break could be, and it turned into a fun lesson on how to reuse scrapped ideas into some diegetic world building. The last thing I needed to do before my first big playtest was build a level, and frankly I was kind of afraid of doing it. I know it seems strange because the other 2 videos on my channel are about level design, but I haven't done level design in a while. I know my fundamentals though. I started with default cubes and ramps and tried my best to teach people the mechanics without any words or signs. From spawning in, you can immediately see a very shiny looking thing and maybe go over to it. this shows 1 out of 10, and hopefully you can see the next pickup in the distance. You start by walking up a ramp, showing that you can't slip up or down slopes like these, and then need to figure out how to jump to get up to the next platform. You hopefully accidentally grab one of these ledges, and then need to figure out that you can double jump to make it across to the platform and get that shiny thing. I tried to design my level around having as many different paths as possible. You can head over this way, loop around the old technology and get a good view of the rest of the level from there. Or you could start by turning left and taking this path up to the highest point. I tried my best to add as many crossroads as possible, so you can get up to this area from the ground, for example, or you can take a back route to skip having to backtrack to where the player spawns in. I should mention too, these random bits of technology are from an asset pack, and the final models I meshed the level out with are as well. For the scale of the project, it was absolutely not feasible to make all my own assets, and these all come from packs that I have the proper licenses to use in a project like this. Even if I was making money from this, I'd still be covered, but this is just an educational project that was made for fun. By this point, I had about 2 weeks until my final deadline, and the game was in a presentable state. Honestly, I could have submitted it then and there and been okay, but I wanted to get as many opinions out there as possible, so I messaged some friends and asked who would be potentially free to do some playtesting, and a lot of people actually said yes. I was quite surprised by that. A lot more people were willing to help than I thought would be. I sent the game to 10-ish people and attached a form with it. It's important to make sure you get the right kind of feedback out of a playtest form. If I just asked people what they thought was missing from the game, then I would have gotten very sporadic answers, as the game was in a very unfinished state. I tried to split it into questions about movement and questions about the project as a whole. So questions about speed, controls, and animation would be about movement, and questions about performance, bugs, and the camera would be about the project. Once I had enough data about if the game functions as it should, then I could move on to extra features or new ideas that might be fun to play around with. There were a lot of bugs I knew about going into the playtest build, but I didn't really know why they happened. For instance, sometimes if you would ledge grab a wall or jump under a platform, you would be teleported to the world origin and fall out of the map. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out why this was happening. So, instead of fixing it for the build, I made it a part of the playtest. I built a room around the world origin, which I called the bad room, and put a few fun details in there. Most importantly, I told people to mention the bad room by name on the feedback form, and how they got in there. I also included a warp out, so players didn't get stuck and have to reset their game, or give up entirely. Of course, there were a lot of bugs I didn't see coming, and a lot of things that in hindsight felt obviously lacking. I forgot I still hadn't fixed that janky idle animation. That was totally on me. Ledge grabs felt very picky, and people felt the airspeed was tuned a bit wrong. There were a lot of extra features people asked for, but knowing the fundamental problems meant I could fix these first and then move on to the new content. I should say as well, the responses were really nice and helpful. People liked the concept and only really had problems with things I expected to be issues, or knew were already janky. At this point, I was really in the final stretch of this project. I think I had about 10 days until my deadline, and most of my other modules work to do as well, so I really needed to put my head down and work on this. A few things were still lacking animations, like the double jump for example. It used the same animation as a grounded jump, which didn't exactly work. There was still a jump squat, which didn't make sense for midair, so I changed to this front flip, which was weirdly easier to animate than I thought it would be. Benefit of the art style. Feedback also said that she felt pretty weightless, and this was helped by giving Flo a more panicked animation that she gradually shifted to as she was falling, based on vertical speed. If this animation reaches a final state of panic, then she also falls face first onto the ground, which definitely helps give a bit of weight. One of the best bits of feedback was about the ledge grab. I figured out what was causing the bad room bug. One of the traces was returning 0, so I just did a check to make sure both traces had a value before completing the ledge grab. The big problem now was that actually attaching to the ledge felt awkward. I had a bit more animation to it, but I hadn't looked at how my source material did it. You have to be facing the wall exactly for it to count as a ledge grab, which makes sense and is how I want that feature to stay, but Flo isn't allowed to rotate midair. Also a deliberate choice that I want to stay. But this means that to ledge grab something, you need to make the decision right from the second you jump. One of my friends on the feedback form said something genius, which is exactly what Animating Time does. Have the double jump also work as your way to reorient yourself to midair. You still lock the player rotation while airborne, but if they double jump, you release control for just a second, so Flo rotates to whatever direction is held. Exactly what I was after, and still kind of annoying that my favourite bit of movement design in my game didn't come from me. Okay, this one was kind of crazy. I showed my supervisor my playtest, and his main note was that Flo needed some kind of voice. I don't like my voice at the best of times, let alone playing a small female stop-motion doll, So I reached out to two of my best friends on a total whim, and for some reason, they both said yes. I actually used both of their voice clips interchangeably and pitch shifted them to fit what I was after. This was a totally new field for me, even just asking for certain voice clips, or learning how to stitch and mix them into gameplay. So I don't know how they both managed to come out with sound clips that really fit Flo independently of one another. It made it feel 1,000 times more real than anything else so far. Something I've been trying to make progress with for ages was probably the most basic question of all. What is my game called? I definitely wanted it to be around Flo. If I was going for a character platformer, they always have the character's name at the title, sometimes as their whole title. I played around with Go With The Flow for a while, but that felt like a very forced pun, and not much good as a name. I mentioned it very casually in conversation with my dad, and he came up with Flo-Motion. Much better. It reads like slow motion, and also works for a game animated to look like stop motion, and works for a tech demo showcasing Flo's movement system. A friend was very lovely and wanted to help make a little logo for the game, which I wanted to fit the multimedia aesthetic I had going on, and this was the end result. I spent the final 2 days on UI and level meshing. I'd only ever touched UI for a HUD, and making a full start menu was definitely new for me, along with these flashy animations for screen transitions and starting the game. The real time-consuming bit was replacing my grey box cubes for the real meshes that I'd found online, especially because I decided to make the main menu feel like a real space. It also meant dealing with lighting, and all of this together absolutely tanked the performance of Flo-Motion on most computers. So actually, I spent a lot of the final day optimizing, shrinking texture file sizes, baking lighting, and using Unreal's default remesher tools to try and get something that would work reasonably on most computers. Eventually though, with half an hour to spare, I uploaded my project to the submission point, and that was that. At about 5 months' work, this was by far the biggest project I've tried so far, and without going too far into evaluation, I was really happy with it. I'll say to anybody who wants to make a game long-term, make it as specialised to your interests as you can. This thing is going to take up so much space in your head, and you will reach the point where the novelty wears off pretty fast. If you make something that you like, then you'll want to talk to people about it, and ideas will start flowing again. For me, I made a character I like, in an art style I like, with gameplay I like, and in a world setting I like. You absolutely do need to be willing to try new and scary things, but if you're going to be devoting hundreds of hours necessary for something like this, make sure that you have fun as you're going. I was quite lucky with how Flo-Motion was received. The project itself got a 97, which is probably about 30% more than I could have ever hoped for. In our final degree show, I even got to make a little stall, with the game playable for anybody to come see and mess around with. I had the doll out, and got my friend who made the logo to make art for some free stickers, and even have a big poster with my name and project on. I still actually have quite a few of the stickers, and even though this happened this summer, I get weirdly nostalgic looking back at it. It's by far the biggest project I've ever made, but for me, Flo-Motion is about proving to myself that I can make something cool as a solo dev. I've only ever made games as part of a big group project, where I was totally locked into being an animator. This though, I got to make all the decisions myself, and making a game piece by piece where you make every decision really makes you feel proud of something, even if it does only take a few minutes to complete. Of course, that's not true at all. From the modelling, retopology, level design, main collectible, main mechanics, movement abilities, UI, promotional art, voice acting, and even the name of the game, nothing about this game would have been possible without really great friends who were happy working purely for the fun of it. I haven't found a good enough way to say thank you yet, but hopefully making this video for you helps. You have made me feel very special and loved, and I still cannot stress how much your time and effort meant to me. Okay, here's the scary part. As of today, Flo-Motion is now available for free on itch.io. I'll put a link on screen and in the description, and if you've liked this video at all, maybe go check it out. I don't really know what else I want to do with the project now. I still think there's a lot more potential buried somewhere in here, and I'd like to have another go at the immersive storytelling I touched on very lightly in the game. The whole thing's meant to feel like you're playing in the room of the person who created the doll. But for now, I want to get this project out there and move on to something new. If you do play it, let me know what you think. Different voices are the only reason this game, and even this video, exist. Thanks for watching.